Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. I'm your host, Hannah Zuberi, and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. In the last 10 years, autocratic and nationalist governments have gained in their struggle against human rights protection and accountability. The slow and compromised response of the United Nations Security Council to the Rohingya Genocide is just one of the many more recent examples of this troubling trend. Today's show highlights two important programs that are taking background from the war criminals and restoring human rights to the position they deserve in policymaking circles and the hallways of power. Justice for All applauds these efforts to build a better world. But first, the news with Burma Task Force and my colleague, Adam Carroll.
Thank you, Sister Hannah. And for some news items. Cyclone Amphan, one of the most powerful in decades, has made landfall today along the coastline of India and Bangladesh. Before it weakened yesterday, Amphan became just the second super cyclone to hit the Bay of Bengal since records began. During the last super cyclone in 1999, nearly 15,000 villages were affected and almost 10,000 people were killed. For this storm, 2.4 million Bangladeshis have been evacuated, complicating COVID-19 quarantine policies. It appears that impact on the Rohingya camps in Cox's Bazar has not been dramatic, but given the continued restrictions on communication in the camps, it is fortunate indeed that the storm did not veer towards the camps or towards the low-lying island of Basan Char, where hundreds of Rohingya refugees are now confined, despite the objections of UN and other international agencies. Sister Hannah?
Yes, thank you so much. This week, we also saw the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum launched an online exhibition exploring how the Rohingya became targets of a sustained campaign of genocide. The exhibition curator photographer Greg Constantine has documented the Rohingya plight for more than 14 years. The museum has raised concerns about the risk of genocide facing the Rohingya since 2013. The museum determined in 2018 that there was compelling evidence that the Burmese military had committed genocide. A temporary exhibition was opened in the museum in the fall. If conditions permit, most likely tours for policymakers and members of the public will start. Did you know, Brother Adam, Shui Mong's father is actually part of that exhibition?
Oh, good. I hope people will go to their website and when the banner goes up for that, hopefully, yeah.
Justice for All also did a exhibition on genocide for the Long Island Holocaust Museum. So that is something people want to bring that once their centers open up. That's something that's a resource that we provide. So if people want to bring that exhibit to their centers, that is something, please reach out to us for that. So Justice for All began as a response to genocide, especially the genocidal policies against Bosnians. And we take seriously the bridge building needed to gain ground in the struggle against injustice wherever it may take place. So my colleague Adam Carroll will be interviewing two amazing guests today. These are people who have been working behind the scene. Today's guests are Nadira Kourt. She's the program manager at the Global Center of the Responsibility to Protect. She conducts research and advocacy at the United Nations on populations at risk of mass atrocities, with the current focus on Burma, China, and North Korea. In addition, Nadira is involved in other projects of the Global Center, including R2P and protection of cultural heritage. Our second guest today is Max Pensky, co-director of Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocities Prevention, GMAP, at Binghamton University. His institute teaches about genocide prevention, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. There's also an atrocities prevention simulation exercise. The Institute's Frontier of Prevention Conference convenes an international community of genocide prevention professionals every year. The GMAP Institute builds solidarity and recently issued a statement of support with atrocity prevention colleagues in Brazil and indigenous people who face destruction of their ways of life and illegal proprietization of lands around the world. The Institute is also part of our faith coalition to stop genocide. Thank you so much for both of you being here and being a part of this discussion with Adam Carroll.
Thank you, Sister Hannah. And we just missed the month that's often a time for reflection on the Holocaust. And many genocide awareness events take place in April. But this issue is always relevant. So not only is the Holocaust Museum involved, but many institutes and many organizations are trying to raise awareness about genocide, especially genocide prevention. So speaking of the Rohingya genocide, this morning our colleagues at Global Justice Center organized an online discussion with the heroic former Special Rapporteur on Burma, Yang Hee Lee, who is now 12 hours away in South Korea, entitled ICJ Provisional Measures: Is Myanmar Protecting the Rohingya from Genocide? In January this year, the International Criminal Court, the Court of Justice, International Court of Justice's ICJ, gave us all hope that the government of Burma would eventually be held accountable and meanwhile work to prevent the ongoing genocide. Burma Task Force has been monitoring Burma's recent behavior with a series of reports over the last 3 months, and we agree with the Special Rapporteur and other panelists that the government of Burma is clearly not in compliance with the court's directives. Nadira, your organization, the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, was involved in setting up this morning's discussion. I'd like to ask about your organization and also briefly, what is the responsibility to protect?
Thank you, Adam, for having me. To begin, so our organization, the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, was established in 2008, a few years after the UN adopted the Responsibility to Protect principle. We focus on 4 international crimes: genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and cover situations where those crimes are occurring or there is a risk of those crimes occurring. So Myanmar is definitely a very serious case where genocide against the Rohingya has happened and atrocities are ongoing in Rakhine State that involved other ethnic communities, and war crimes and crimes against humanity taking place elsewhere around the country. So there's definitely impunity for the crimes, and unfortunately it leads to more crimes. Just to comment on the ICJ process, we see it, of course, as not everything that will change for the Rohingya, but it's a very important step forward. And a year ago, most people thought that that would not be possible, and now we see that it's a very important step towards justice and accountability for the Rohingya. The provisional measures, as you mentioned, unfortunately, Myanmar is not in compliance fully. The discriminatory structures are still very much in place. But nonetheless, it brings more attention to the situation. And the case is going to go on for a few years. And hopefully, things will still change in the country.
Yeah, thanks. UN. I mean, the UN, for people who don't work there, may seem like a monolithic entity, but they say the UN does this, the UN does that. But there's so many parts to the UN, as you know. So maybe if you could tell a bit about how you engage with the different parts of the UN.
Yes, that's a good point. The UN is really made up of member states of countries, right? Something that people around the world not always realize, that the UN is not a monolith. So some things that cannot be accomplished at the Security Council level, which is made up of 15 countries, 5 of them with the veto power, it can be accomplished in other parts of the UN, including the General Assembly, which includes all governments around the world, or Human Rights Council, which is based in Geneva and focuses on human rights situations, or other parts of the US that deal of the UN, where they deal with humanitarian issues or refugee issues, such as UNHCR. So very important to keep that in mind. Even now, when it comes to Myanmar, even though it's so difficult to push for action at the UN Security Council level, we try to engage as much as possible Security Council members, but also members of the General Assembly, members of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and other bodies that are linked to those members, to those entities. So in terms of our engagement, we very much operate as an insider and outsider actor. We work together with different governments, for example, on initiatives that we have, or co-hosting certain events or campaigns. At the same time, we also do advocacy with them, and we push for action around certain topics. So with Myanmar, we push for a resolution at the Security Council, at the General Assembly. We push for sanctions. All governments can take bilateral action, as well as action within their regional organizations to place sanctions on Myanmar for the genocide, as well as other countries who perpetrate atrocities. So we engage with them at an expert level, at the missions in New York and Geneva, at more high level, ambassador level, and engage in public as well as private advocacy. So that includes letters and statements, that includes private conversation, public events, and many other initiatives.
People may not realize that, of course, at the Security Council level, China is blocking most action on Burma, for example, and Russia is also following along the same what do you call it, the playlist, whatever. But so nothing is really happening from the Security Council, but you are finding innovative ways to engage member states in the Security Council to continue putting pressure. It is on the calendar, it is on the agenda. Then there, as you mentioned, is the General Assembly, the folks in Geneva, the Human Rights Council there. Again, China is determined to play interference and block sanctions against Burma, but you are able to get a number of things done. Some of those things have come about because of a very active special rapporteur, and that she was able to get a fact-finding mission to do a very credible and extensive investigation. Then there has been the IIM. I was wondering if you could speak about some of those mechanisms.
Yes, absolutely. And again, going back to that sometimes deadlock at the Security Council doesn't mean that that the wider UN system cannot act on issues. So Human Rights Council established fact-finding mission. And again, just to connect the dots, fact-finding mission was instrumental in the ICJ case that the Gambia later filed against Myanmar. They very much relied on the findings of the fact-finding mission, that genocide and other atrocities took place in Myanmar. So that's very important for many reasons. Another mechanism that you mentioned is the International Independent Mechanism on Myanmar, which will be a more legal mechanism that is consolidating and collecting evidence for future prosecution for cases, including for ICC and ICJ potentially. So again, another very great initiative, even though justice is unattainable at the domestic level in Myanmar, and it cannot be mandated given the circumstances by the Security Council. Other parts of the UN seized on various opportunities and have contributed to advancing the issue of accountability and justice. So those two mechanisms are great examples. Now we also have a new special rapporteur on Myanmar as of earlier this month. And also we have more hope that he can continue in the footsteps of Yang Li, who is an excellent special rapporteur, as you mentioned. So even though it may seem that it's difficult on some levels, other levels of the UN are very much active on this. So there's definitely some hope.
Yeah, and speaking of all these mechanisms, these workarounds to avoid the veto of China, well, are any of those good examples for work on other issues? For example, can the lessons of Myanmar or Burma be used in the work on behalf of the Uyghur in China?
Yes, in fact, the two situations are somewhat similar. We have a minority group, the Uyghurs, that are being very strongly discriminated against by the Chinese government. Many of them are confined to internment camps, up to 1 million. It's very hard to get access, similarly to the situation in Rakhine State. Very limited information getting out of those camps, but what we know really amounts to crimes against humanity. So it's a very dire situation. And of course, China is also on the Security Council, so it will be impossible to hold a meeting on this topic there, at least not a formal meeting. But again, other parts of the UN system can get engaged in the issue, and they have done so already to some extent. And we hope that more can be done, that member states can push for the High Commissioner to get access to Xinjiang, where most Uyghurs live. Perhaps the Human Rights Council or the General Assembly could also mandate a fact-finding mission on Xinjiang. That's something also that was done in other countries and doesn't require UN Security Council action. A lot can be done. Again, in individual capacity, states and regional organizations can also push for sanctions, business restrictions for those who engage in labor, forced labor activities with Uyghur workers who are coerced to do forced labor, essentially. Countries can also increase their asylum seekers from Xinjiang. And so there's a lot that can be done individually by countries, but also at the UN level, engagement by General Assembly and Human Rights Council, by special rapporteurs on various topics.
I realize, China casts a long shadow even in Geneva, and it's difficult to get around that fact. But then again, the U.S. and other countries also play power politics, as we see with this recent kerfuffle regarding the WHO, the World Health Organization, and COVID-19. And so UN is very imperfect, and sometimes this political noise distracts us from the fact that reform is needed, and sometimes there are concerns about the policies of the UN. There was even a Gert Rosenthal quite critical report that came out last year examining the failures of the UN system regarding the Rohingya. And at least this shows some will on the part of the UN system to learn from its mistakes. Do you think that that's what's happening?
Unfortunately, even though we keep saying never again, it's because so much politics is involved. We see again and again that atrocities are taking place, and the UN is, to say the least, is underperforming. But also they don't really speak with a unified voice, which is a problem, and that was highlighted in the Rosenthal report. And we heard some positive statements coming out from the Office of the Secretary General that reported influences prevention agenda and some other initiatives that were put forward after that, and that the way resident coordinators, those are main UN representatives in different countries, including Myanmar, that they have received different instructions on how to operate in situations where human rights are violated in countries where they operate. So I don't think it will be, we will see changes overnight, but that just highlights the fact that we have to continue to point out situations when the UN is underperforming or they're not speaking with a unified voice on issues that have to be unequivocally condemned, such as a genocide.
Your organization has good access, I would say, and is well respected among NGOs at the UN. And you've organized various panels, various meetings. I don't know if you participated in ARIA formula meetings. I think you have, but I'm wondering, as in your role as expert, you could say a little bit about how the Global Center for Responsibility to Protect has engaged directly with member states.
Yes. Speaking of ARIA formula meeting, for the audience that maybe don't know what that is, those are more of an informal format for a meeting. So let's say there's a deadlock of the Security Council on a public meeting on Myanmar or any other topic, and they cannot agree on having it on the formal agenda. Any country on the Security Council can choose to do a more of an informal meeting. Some of them are called ARIA formal meeting. So that gives important attention to an issue, but still allows it to be on the agenda of the council, and it still encourages the country that is being discussed to do more. So we know for a fact that the Myanmar government was not pleased with the ARIA formula on accountability taking place last year, and they also have they regularly either form commissions or issue statements in reaction to meetings of the Security Council, even informal ones. So we know that those meetings are effective. As the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, we try to encourage member states to organize those kind of meetings, even when unified action may seem impossible. So on any topic, such as Myanmar or any, we follow a dozen situations from all parts of the world where mass atrocities are happening. And when action is deadlocked, we encourage various kind of action. And of course, resolutions and press statements, other products of the Security Council as well. How we engage is at a high level. We have sometimes dinners and lunches informally with ambassadors. So at a high level, at an expert level, we engage with experts on different country situations, provide our analysis of the situation, our research, as well as recommendations on what policy action can take place. So it's a multi-layer engagement in New York and in Geneva, and some of it helps kind of consolidate steps forward so that the situation can be addressed.
So, Nadira, where would you like us to be a year from now, given all the the challenges of COVID-19 and the UN being shut down as far as in-person meetings, but meetings are ongoing, and certainly genocide and mass atrocities are ongoing in the world. So what would you like to see accomplished in the next year?
It may be a difficult question, but I guess it also depends on which country situation you talk about. But in general, I guess when you talk about Myanmar, what we would really like to see is for member states to really pay attention to the root causes and realize that those are still there, and to really dive into what led to the genocide and what we can do to prevent it from reoccurring. So really address the situation of citizenship and freedom of movement, access to healthcare, education, etc. When you talk about China, again, it would be great to see access to that part of the country where Uyghurs live. It would be great to have member states issue public statements condemning the situation, so that a year from now we're not just looking at people suffering in those parts of the world, but actually proactively trying to make a difference. Whether that will take, whether that will be a resolution on a situation or another fact-finding mission or a commission set up by some bodies of the UN. I think all those little steps add up and they do make a difference, sometimes not immediately, but it is important that we continue to be seized, even if it looks like that there is very little progress.
Well, it seems that there's some signs for hope for the Rohingya, but it's not immediate resolution, and people are in the camps and facing bad weather today, but also many rights restrictions and not allowed to work, not given their rights back either in the camps or in their homeland, Rakhine State. So the Rohingya don't have any answers, but I guess there is a sense that of some progress. With the Uyghur, it's less clear. And so I think that we are all working to prevent genocide and to bring justice and accountability into play in current situations. So as far as your organization's work in the coming weeks, do you have any planned organized events coming up?
Well, everything has changed during the times of the coronavirus, unfortunately. But something that I wanted to highlight is that this year marks the 15th anniversary of the adoption of the Responsibility to Protect principle. And again, as a reminder, it covers 4 international crimes: genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. So we should take it as an opportunity to really highlight and reaffirm our commitment to this principle. And that's something we also advocate for member states to do. So unfortunately, many of our events have to be shifted to the virtual platforms, but those are important nonetheless. And in fact, what we have observed with the webinar we organized earlier that you mentioned, is that people are able to join from all over the world. So you can actually attract a really wider audience. So we will continue to organize meetings virtually until we can do so in person. With the General Assembly, probably that will not be happening in September. We'll have to reevaluate ways to engage with the Security Council, but we continue to do so by virtual means at the moment.
Right. We don't want to let the authoritarians win and use this current crisis of the COVID-19 virus as a tactic in their push against human rights. So I think that we're trying to also be strategic, all of us NGOs and friends of the Rohingya, friends of the Uyghur, partners with impacted communities everywhere. So building a culture of genocide prevention, a culture of human rights. I'd like to bring on Max Pensky, professor and co-director of the institute in Geneva, which is called IMAP. What does IMAP stand for?
Hi, Adam. Hi, everybody. It's nice
GMAP. Yes.
So the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention here at Binghamton University in upstate New York.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And so the IGMAP is Institute for Genocide and
Mass Atrocity Prevention.
Right. So why don't you just say genocide prevention? Why do you include mass atrocities there as well?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I could give you a very long answer, but the short answer is that what we've found, and what I think a lot of our colleagues have found, is that we're no longer really willing to go with the idea of genocide as being somehow the top of a hierarchy of international crimes, along with crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against peace. I think that what we see as genocide certainly is an international crime that is so devastating and so costly for all involved that it does continue to be foregrounded in a lot of important ways. At the same time, in terms of the law and in terms of the risks that vulnerable populations face, there really is no hierarchy of international crimes. So that we want to make sure that what we're preventing is, in broadly speaking terms, the kind of organized collective violence that is directed against vulnerable populations on the basis of their identity, whether that is a genocidal act as specified in the law, whether that's crimes against humanity, or whether those are war crimes in the context of armed conflict.
Because sometimes regarding genocide, there's a sense that we need to get nations to declare genocides in order to compel them to act, and then other groups feel that that's counterproductive, and that because it makes it a zero-sum game, and so it is useful to use multiple terminology. But do you also agree that it would be useful to declare genocide in certain cases?
Only in those cases where where the evidence really warrants it. I think that in some senses, as you mentioned, I think it's true that the term genocide is such a powerful term, such an evocative term, that it's difficult sometimes to bear in mind that in addition to the popular meaning that we attach to that term, there's also the technical legal definition, which is really quite narrow and defined in terms of the precise language of the Genocide Convention from 1948. And so I think that I don't have a simple answer to this question, but I would say that depending on the context, depending on the facts on the ground, depending on the organization, I do think that there are times when calling a genocide is exactly the right thing to do in order to generate the kind of public sunlight, the kind of public visibility and outrage that might motivate more collective action. I also think that we have not infrequently found ourselves in a situation of believing that massive and widespread crimes against humanity, for example, the targeting of civilian populations, the infliction of severe forms of violent persecution, are somehow less serious than genocides, when in point of fact, they're just different legal definitions. And we must be very careful, I think, in terms of the tactics, both of prevention actors, to really get our terms straight, I think.
Well, that brings us to the prevention aspect, which I think your institute is very active to bring practitioners, activists, academics, policymakers all together in order to really strengthen the mechanisms, strengthen the political will, if you put it that way, to prevent genocide. Because obviously with Rwanda, Cambodia, with the Yazidis, with Bosnia, with the Rohingya, we failed to prevent genocide. And so this failure seems to be repeated again and again. So building up a better capacity, what does your institute do in order to achieve that?
Well, we have a lot of things that we do, but I guess what I would focus on most from the perspective of our particular institute is that we try to lower the barriers and try to reduce what we think of as artificial barriers between the world of academic research on the one side and the world of prevention practice on the other, whether that's in NGOs like Nadira's great organization or in the part of states. So at GMAP, we think that the modern research university and the modern production of academic scholarship is a tremendously powerful tool for knowledge production, for critical insights into understanding and interrupting the processes that enhance risk for mass atrocity crimes. But we also think that very often that kind of knowledge is very specialized. Academics, as for anyone who's ever had any contact with us, academics tend to be homebodies. We like to stay in academia. Often we produce wonderful new forms of knowledge and insight, but they're not packaged and written and presented in a way that practitioners can really access and make use of. So one of the most important things that we think of ourselves as doing is trying to lower the threshold or the barriers for a real productive interchange between academics on the one side and practitioners on the other side.
I mean, I noticed that you have some fellowships and visiting scholars who have been active in international courts, for example, Cambodia, where people can learn from different trials, different situations, hopefully build some kind of institutional memory or professional memory so that there is a field of genocide prevention and it's not just an ad hoc response, usually too late. I wanted to ask you about what kind of students come to your program and what are their interests?
That's a great question. I think that one of the things that we've really tried to put forward is that atrocity prevention as an academic field really is university-wide, in the sense that we often think of, for example, things like genocide studies as being really focused on things like history or political science. We often think of peace-building programs as being focused on international relations. These are all really important academic disciplines, and we work in them ourselves. At the same time, we're really convinced with the idea that every academic discipline, every approach to organized study has some potential contribution to make to atrocity prevention, and therefore a broad conception of prevention, which is the one that we adopt here, means that we have to try to make a bigger and bigger tent. So when we look at our students, for example, our undergraduates, those between, let's say, 18 and 21 or so, sure, we get our kids who are studying history and political science and things like that, but we also want to reach out to kids who are studying marketing, which has a huge, a sort of a way of reaching out and understanding how businesses work and supply chain management works is an enormously important factor in atrocity prevention. If you think, for example, of the Tatmada's various business interests in Burma, you can see that. Creative writing, cinematography, museum curation, geography in terms of global mapping and remote sensing, nursing. All of these different academic fields have been, in our opinion, more or less marginalized, or at least not asked to the table in terms of building a form of atrocity prevention that one can build into one's academic exercises. So we're drawing students from all over the university, from all different forms of study. And very shortly, we'll be launching the first of its kind in the world professional master's degree in genocide and mass atrocity prevention. And there we hope to be drawing students from all over the world.
It's very inclusive. And there could be a role for anyone listening to this program in some respects. How about your mass atrocity simulation? How does that fit in?
That's another that's another collaboration that we've made with not with practitioners. In this case, a very well-known person who named Jim Finkel, who many people know as being one of the architects of the atrocity prevention task force back in the United States. Has put together a series of atrocity prevention simulations. And so how this works is the students are asked to play the role of different actors in an unfolding atrocity situation that happens in real time. And they are asked to try. I mean, they're divided into teams, so it's a very big group exercise. In teams, they receive updates of information, and they have to work out how they're going to respond, given the information they have in real time, to a very high-risk situation with imperfect and asymmetrical information. So, in terms of what we would often call the pillar 3 of the responsibility to protect, which is to say, an actual crisis that is unfolding in real time. Different actors, let's say states or the media or an NGO, have to decide how they're going to react, and they have to come up with these decisions together and then find out what the consequences are. It gives the students, I think, a slight experience that they wouldn't ordinarily get reading books and writing term papers about just how difficult it really is to try to steer these enormous institutions like states or the UN or the European Union or NATO in a direction where there is too little time, too many lives at stake, and not enough known.
Yeah, I mean, atrocities often take place during summer vacations, I've noticed. So, I mean, how do you deal with not having enough colleagues at the office, or even an atrocity during a health crisis like this? So those factors can be folded in. What groups or individuals participate in these simulations? Is it just for students, or is it also for organizations or community partners?
It's for all of them. I mean, I think that we've only done this once so far, and it was an extraordinarily interesting, I think really rewarding experience for the students. One of the things that we found was really interesting is that we're always trying to bring in actual practitioners of atrocity prevention to our students, to have them meet them, work with them, have lunch with them, talk to them about what their life is like. So there's constantly what we call resident practitioners or visiting practitioners who are coming to campus to meet with our students. And this is no exception. So each one of these teams that we make has an advisor that we invite from the outside. And this will be a person who's familiar with the subject of whatever that exercise is, and who can say things like, yeah, when I had to do this in Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1995, when I had to do this in Colombia in 2014, that's not what it was like. We had to worry about this. And so each team has, as it were, a real life person with real field experience, not to tell them how to think, but for them to draw on and say, well, what was it like for you when you were actually trying to figure this out, and not as an exercise, but as an actual experience.
I do remember August 25th, 2017, and that week, or that period of 10 days, we had received lots of troubling reports about military platoons descending on Rakhine State and putting checkpoints up, more checkpoints, and people were hungry and not able to get out of their villages, and something was clearly happening. Yang He was sending letters, some people in Congress were sending letters, we were sending letters, and yet none of those letters, and again, there's the famous Archer Blood letters. It seems like letters don't stop genocide or mass atrocities, and so, so it's frustrating to see how voices of concern can fall into a bureaucratic void. And so, how do we work to prevent that? So I think that this is all about preventing genocide. And so you also have conferences. And I know that because of COVID-19, you just had to cancel one conference that you put a lot of work into planning.
We did.
But if you could just say something about your conferences.
Well, the conference, like everything else we do, is a way of bringing academics and practitioners together in an informal setting, so that they can really understand what each other's lives and challenges are like. It's not a conference in the sense of academics giving papers. I mean, I think for most of us academics, we do this all the time. It's our comfort zone, and we really wanted to move to a different model. And so in the in the way that we do it, we're divided up into panels. Each panel has a subject of what's going on, what's emerging, what's happening around the world, where there's an opportunity to really dig into and understand more about mechanisms for prevention or for risk reduction that are working and that are not. And each panel has a mix of academics and non-academics who are really, have something to say on the issue. And rather than giving their, formal papers and presentations, they talk to each other. They share experiences, they share frustrations, they share successes. And then they're able to answer the audience's questions. So it's a very informal but intense model. The other thing that we've been really stressing is that we're also trying to break with the model that atrocity prevention is too often a dialogue between people in the global north about problems in the global south. So one of the things that we really wanted to do, and we've been able to do, is be able to invite our colleagues, both academics and practitioners from the global south, up here, way up to upstate New York, and be able to allow them to do that, so that they literally have a place at the table, so that they can literally be included in their own, in discussion about their own national and or social struggles. And I think that's, for us, extraordinarily important. I guess the lemonades, if you want, of the cancellation of the conference is that maybe those barriers can be even lowered if we have to continue on online platforms like this one.
Yeah. I mean, of course, there's no internet service in the camps or in Rakhine State, but a lot of the impact communities can engage in this way, and we should continue to build that partnership. I was wondering if Nadira is still on, because I wanted to call her up to join the discussion. Hi, Nadira.
Hi.
Do you have any questions or comments to make at this stage about any of the things that we've been talking about?
I just wanted to highlight that I think it's a great initiative to bring together academics and practitioners. I think there's so much important scholarship that is produced by various universities around the world on RTP, on mass atrocities, and not everything trickles down or up to UN officials. And I think the more that can take place, the better. So we can really build on these various findings, on best practices and lessons learned, and really so that information can be utilized by those who make policy every day and make a difference for people on the ground. So I think it's really great. It's also very important to educate the next generation of policymakers. So your program is, I think, is very valuable.
Thank you.
I see that your institute works on mass atrocities and transitional justice in the Congo, in Kenya, even the United States. Mm-hmm. Atrocity Early Warning Task Force, which I'm glad that it still exists under this administration. So trying to encourage each member state to have a strong mechanism, whether it's Latin America, whether it's Africa, or wherever. Mm-hmm. And so how we can have a safety net, if you will, in case of an emerging crisis. So how do you deal with the UN? Do you regularly link with the United Nations or the international community?
Well, to be perfectly honest, one of the ways that we found most useful is to work with partners like the Global Center, because why reinvent the wheel, in a sense? I mean, the Global Center has been a really sorry. The Global Center, I don't know if that was me or not. The Global Center, for instance, is an extraordinary organization, and they've been a really valuable partner to us. We've learned a tremendous amount from them about how to think through our relationships with UN partners. So they're one of the example of the kind of the NGO academic interface that I think does actually work and is value added for both sides. We've built up relationships with various people at various offices at the UN. We keep in touch with them. We've brought them to conferences. We've brought them out to be visiting practitioners. It's really important for us to learn as much as we can about how the world looks from the perspective of a United Nations staff person who cares deeply about the issues that we care about, but obviously cares about them through the institutional lenses that they have to deal with, they have to work with. And so I think for us, it can be very valuable often to sort of bring, Moses to the mountain, as it were, and to bring UN staffers, especially from, for example, the office of for the special advisor, out to Binghamton to get them sort of out of their usual UN comfort zone, and really ask them a little bit more talk to us about how you see things. How do you see the Security Council working? So sometimes it's off the record, obviously, but I think there's a great deal of value in finding ways, perhaps more informal ways, to build networks of relationships of trust with people in the UN, and so we can really find your way in. Something that Nadira would obviously know a lot more about than I would.
We're going to have to wind up in a couple of minutes. Just really briefly, I was wondering if either of you could speak about the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocity Prevention Act in the U.S. that President Trump signed.
Mm-hmm. Well, very briefly, we'll see whether the provisions of the act get funded. We'll see whether the current administration makes a good faith effort to implement some of the things that survived in the legislation. We will see whether the new form of the Atrocity Prevention Study Group has, as it were, a mission or a brief that will make sense. We'll see whether the educational requirements and the reporting requirements are kept. I wouldn't say that I'm hugely optimistic. I think that there's certainly value there, but to us right now, it's for the next 2 years anyway. It's going to be just a waiting game.
Right. Well, I'm going to ask Sister Hannah Zuberi to come back on and see the show out. And I think as far as getting our grassroots supporters and members involved is one way we can press for this legislation to really get funded and get support that we need. Sister Hannah, you're on mute. Yeah.
You're still on mute.
Thank you so much to both of you for being here today, and for Adam for leading this great discussion. I had a quick question of the two of you, is that if you could say in a few words, what would you change, like after with all your expertise and dealing with the United Nations, and since we work on the ground, and we see a lot of frustration by activists, by impacted people, what would, just in a few words, what would you like to see changed about this process to make prevention more achievable?
Maybe I can jump in. I think it's very, very important to hear from people who are at the center of these atrocities. I think sometimes member states focus on very kind of top level multilateral issues and forget that we're talking about real people who are suffering greatly at the hands of either their governments or other groups within their communities. So the more engagement with NGOs or civil society, individual activists, the better, so that we're reminded that behind all those layers of policy, the real people and real suffering that they have to deal with every day. So maybe it's one of the things that could be different, but we try to push as much as we can for representation of civil society at the UN.
Yeah, I would agree completely with that. I would just add that one of the things I would say is that I would say that atrocity prevention is everybody's business. Working with UN actors and UN agencies is certainly absolutely vital, but everybody has a part to play. Everybody can educate themselves. Everybody can learn about the various initiatives and news sources and ways to contribute that are accessible to them. Everybody can bring a unique perspective and set of knowledge and skills to bear. So prevention is an extraordinarily broad global effort that is extraordinarily exclusive, and everybody has a place there, I think.
Thank you. That's a great note to end on. To all our audience, thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to share a few action points before we wrap up the show tonight. We have a great partner with the refugiesinternational.org. And partnership over there is that there is going to be a massive push on social media under the hashtag called Call It Genocide and Act for Rohingya. As you all know, the State Department to this day in the United States has not called the Rohingya genocide a genocide. The Congress has, the House has, but the State Department hasn't, despite the very, very deep and productive report that they did that has been scientifically backed, just a really great report that the State Department did. They still have not made that legal determination. So this, in partnership with the refugiesinternational.org, we are pushing for this action. We want you guys to get online, get on your phones, write to your write to the State Department. You can leave a comment on their comment line, and really make a fuss about this. And the time has come for the State Department to recognize that this is a genocide. So call it genocide and hashtag Act for Rohingya. So this launches tomorrow, and just wanted to give everybody a heads up on that. And as we end this beautiful month of Ramadan that is coming rapidly coming to an end for us, last night we had an amazing, beautiful, emotional night of spirituality and activism with our Power Hour for the Powerless Ummah Webathon. You guys all participated. We had over 5,000 views. You guys shared it, and you gave with your heart, but we haven't reached our target. So our matching grant is for 120,000. Remember, we are an independent organization. We don't take grants from any organization. This is a personal donor who is making this donation and has offered 120,000 if we can come up with the rest. So I urge you to go to giving.justiceforall.org and help us get to our goal. We just have about 20,000, maybe 25,000 more to go. So I really urge you, ask your friends, be a sustainable, monthly donor if you can. That always works. Thank you so much, and we'll see you tomorrow.